Okay, so the Venice Biennale is the largest and the oldest art event of its kind in the world. It was established, as we'll see, in the late 19th century as a way of bringing art to Venice, and by bringing the art to Venice, the hope was it would bring people to Venice. And the very first exhibition in 1895 managed to attract around 200,000 people, which is a huge number, especially for the late 19th century. And each year that the Biennale is on today, it's usually around 500,000 to 600,000 people coming to see it. So that sounds like it would be huge, and that sounds like it would be crowded, but the Biennale goes from May until November when it's on. So it's people coming to the city over a very long period of time. So you can walk around all sorts of odd spaces in the city and be able to see without kind of, unless you're there in the opening week, without kind of people pushing and shoving and kind of elbowing you, trying to get a look at what you're trying to look at. But what I'll start with for the Biennale is this sculpture from the 2019 Biennale, the Opulent Ascension by Scully. So Scully is probably best known as an abstract painter, but more recently he's been looking back to his, I suppose, his childhood spirituality. And in creating this whopping great big sculpture, as you can see, it's filling up this space of underneath the dome of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, the Palladian Church, one of the symbols of Venice and one of the largest churches in Venice. And you get an idea of the scale of it. However, when he's thinking about his childhood spirituality, and the reason why this is in this church in particular is a little bit more complex. So the church is still run and still owned by Benedictine monks. But rather than trying to push a particular idea of spirituality, about 15 years ago, the abbot decided that he could use this majestic space, this beautiful classicizing space of Palladio's, to present contemporary art that would hopefully help people to start thinking about issues around peace or their own spirituality, regardless of what their beliefs are. So it's very much not about pushing any particular message, not about pushing any particular ideology or belief system. And that's something that's become a real strength of the Venice Biennale, that it's a place for sharing all sorts of ideas through contemporary art, and a place to try and foster and develop discussion. The work here, though, is made from, it looks like it should be huge and heavy, but these are actually made from effectively kind of foam mattressing, which is then kind of covered over with velvet. And what helps make this work look so bright in this space is partly the natural illumination coming through the dome and coming through the clerestory windows, but also the fabric itself, the softness of the velvet means that the light doesn't shine off it. The light hits it, and you get that strength of color. Whereas if you use something shiny or plasticky, it would start to look a bit, I suppose, tacky. What's also interesting about a work such as this, which I think is very emblematic of the Biennale, is once it's opened, so this was from just before it had officially opened, this barrier is taken down and you can walk around the work. As you walk around the work, you come around the back and you notice that there's a door, just about a meter wide and about 2 meters high, and you can walk inside the sculpture. And it's then when you look up, and you look up towards the source of the light coming down from the dome, that you find that Scully has made the effect of a circle of light appear inside a square, and the reflection of the light down the inside walls turns that into a star as well. So there's this spirit of exploration and surprise that comes from an event like this. There's also that beautiful contrast between the very, very contemporary and the very, very classical side by side, which is another strength of the Biennale, as we'll see. So the Biennale is an enormously successful event, and it remains the largest art show in the world, both in terms of the number of visitors who come to it, but more importantly, the sheer number of participants, the number of artists' work that's on display in Venice is gigantic. However, it's a very constantly evolving exhibition. So every time it's on, each edition, as they call it, can be very, very different from the previous ones. So if you go to it multiple times, what you see is you're getting the best contemporary art from around the world, and then 2 years later, you're getting the best contemporary art from around the world. But because it's a very decentralized exhibition, no one person is in control, giving direction to what it should look like. So this means you get kind of an amazing degree of variety. So on the top right here is an image of a picture of one of the Biennale spaces. This is the Giardini Biennale. So this is in the Castello district of Venice. It's just up behind the Arsenale, the historic shipyards of Venice. And it used to be an area where the workers of the Arsenale used to live until Napoleon came along and decided the people of Venice needed a proper open park with avenues to parade down. So we knocked down the workers' accommodation to build a park. In the 1890s, that park is then given over to the Biennale to start using as an exhibition space. So as you're walking along through these, and it's Venice, so of course there are no cars, as you're walking along through these beautiful tree-lined avenues, you go past pavilions such as these on the right and the left, and each of these belong to a different different country. So along here, we'll see a closer one of this is the Danish Pavilion that was designed by Alvar Aalto. Over the road from it, you've got the Swiss Pavilion. And if you're walking down here on the lower right image, we're walking down here past Denmark, past Switzerland, Venezuela, the Nordic countries. You make your way down this way, then down to Australia. You can go and visit Hungary, you can go and visit the Netherlands. So this is a huge site, and as you walk down it, you can just drop into one of these buildings to see what that country has on display. One of the other kind of main spaces of the Biennale, though, is this one here on the lower left. This is in the Arsenale in Venice. So the Arsenale had been the historic shipyards of Venice since about the 11th or 12th centuries, and it was once one of the largest shipyards in all of Europe, especially because in the Middle Ages, Venice had the largest navy in Europe. These buildings, though, had been mostly abandoned in the 20th century. No one builds ships in Venice anymore except for gondolas because the lagoon is just too shallow to get to for heavy shipbuilding in the city. So instead they go and do that at the port of Marghera instead nearby. So that left these historic, huge industrial spaces vacant. And they remained vacant up until the 1980s, when the Biennale manages to acquire the right to use some of these spaces as exhibition space. So what we're looking at here is just one section, one room of a 700-meter long building. This building used to be the place where the ropes were made for all the rigging of Venice's ships. So it's a very, very long building. It's about 700 meters long. It's about 50 meters wide. And as you walk down along through this space, you've got art to the left of you, art to the right of you, art on the ground, sometimes art in the sky, all by different contemporary artists. It's a very difficult space for a curator to use, however, because it's so long that you don't want people to kind of get tired halfway through and decide to leave. But being Italy, naturally, just on the left-hand side, about 2/3 of the way down, there's a door that takes you through to a cafe, because ultimately you can't be in Italy if you can't grab a coffee really easily. So this space here in the Arsenale added about 4 hectares of exhibition space to the Biennale. So you have this huge space in the Giardini, where a lot of nations are participating. You have this huge space in the Arsenale, but that's only a very small number of the total amount of spaces. So while the Giardini and the Arsenale are the 2 biggest spaces in Venice, you find that there are different exhibitions scattered around the whole city. So you kind of be strolling through the city, it's Venice, you've got these beautiful Gothic, Renaissance and Baroque buildings all around you. You've got people enjoying themselves, and then you can duck through a doorway and suddenly be confronted by some spectacular contemporary art exhibitions. So up here on the left is from a map I made from 2015, just showing where a number of the locations of different art exhibitions. So each of these dots represents a different venue. In some of those venues, such as say the Giardini, just over here, you've got a huge central exhibition, and then you have say 25 national exhibitions, and that's just got one dot on the map for it. In other places, you might find that there is just a small single exhibition, or you might walk into a building, discover it has 4 floors of contemporary art. So as you're walking through, you've got this wonderful refreshment where you go from the contemporary through to kind of what we know and love Venice for, with its architecture, its quietness, the boats and whatnot. And you move back and forth between the very, very contemporary and the more distant past that surrounds us in Venice. So to give you an idea, for example, of how these contrasts sometimes appear, we have here an exhibition from the Palazzo Grassi that was part of the Biennale last year of the Belgian painter Luc Thoemans. So you have his wonderful, kind of very soft, gentle, slightly abstract, slightly figurative works. He kind of moves between abstraction and figurative painting. But as you're moving around these very meditative works, looking at historical memory, you suddenly look up and you realize that above you is the original 18th century coffered ceiling from the 3-story palace. So you have this kind of, again, this wonderful contrast between styles, between the old and the new. However, as an institution, the Biennale is quite complex because it's very, very decentralized. And ultimately, the institution is very, very small. And this allows them to devolve most of the power to choose what art is going on display to other people. And this, I think, kind of allows it not to be too samey. If you've got all of this art in one place and one person is in control of it, it might start to feel very samey very quickly, whereas you don't find that happening in Venice. So institutionally, the Biennale of Venice is a body that was formed in the 1890s just to have general oversight of an international Biennale of art. However, it has grown substantially across the 20th century, and now it has biennales of art, dance, architecture, theatre, and the Venice Film Festival as well, are all brought together under this single organisation, which has kind of a role in administering these places, making sure everyone is following the rules, and making sure that it remains free of the sorts of corruption that can sometimes happen with the large amounts of money that are surrounding contemporary art. So each year it has oversight. This committee, this small kind of organisation, has oversight of between 120 and 150 different exhibitions in the city of Venice. They have a central exhibition that they curate themselves. They appoint an international curator who then also sets a theme for the year. So they might say, kind of, well, this year we're going to look at how we imagine the future, kind of all the possible futures that might happen once the world finally collapses. Or in another year, we might be looking at kind of, well, let's try and get inside how do artists understand their own art. But while we have this curator of a central exhibition, none of the other participating countries are obliged to follow that theme. Each country is allowed, in effect, to go and do its own thing. However, the Biennale has come to mean much more than what it is officially. So although the Biennale committee is only really officially looking after 120 to 150 exhibitions during each edition, when the Biennale is on, there are typically more than 200 exhibitions of art in Venice, which are on between May and November. So you have some of these are part of the Biennale, but then you have a whole range of other organisations showcasing, having art exhibitions, renting space in the city if they don't have permanent space, so that they can show off art too. So you have this kind of the idea of the Biennale being about one thing, but it's grown to become so large that it kind of people know that other people are coming to Venice, so art galleries will put shows on in Venice during the Biennale because they know they have, in effect, a captive audience, an audience who are interested to see. So, for example, in numbers, just in 2019, the central exhibition that takes place in part of the Arsenale and part of a single building in the Giardini had only 79 artists on display across 2 very, very large venues. The previous edition, those same spaces had more than 400 artists involved in the exhibition. So kind of the number of works by individual artists you can see is already extraordinary just from that one central exhibition alone. You then had 89 national pavilions. These are countries such as Australia who pay to have a permanent presence in Venice to be able to show what Australian contemporary artists are doing. You then had 21 official collateral exhibitions, ones that weren't part of what a nation was doing, but these were nonetheless, the Biennale said, yes, that's very much what we're trying to achieve this year. So yes, we'll advertise you as an official collateral. You're officially a kind of on the side of the main Biennale. But then you had 86 privately organised and publicised exhibitions going at the same time. Then you had 13 major art foundations holding exhibitions within the city. And then you have 16 major museums in Venice, which had special exhibitions on during the Biennale as well. So the Biennale is so large that it's very, no one can actually see it all. So kind of when you kind of read reviews of it in the newspapers, the reviewer might have had a couple of days to try and get around this, and it's impossible. So they will only have seen a very small selection. I think the most I've got up to is about 90 to 95%, but that was because I was in Venice for about 3 months that year. So it is a gigantic enterprise. Some of these collateral exhibitions, though, aren't exhibitions as we typically think of them. So you may have seen photos of these hands in Venice. These are photos by hands that were sculpted by Lorenzo Quinn. He made these in his studio in Barcelona, and then they had them shipped to Venice. And then these two hands were brought down the Grand Canal in barges and then installed in the lagoon in such a way that they look like they're rising up out of the water to hold the city up. So we have all the fears in Venice of the loss of the city, the fear of rising sea levels, the fears of climate change, but up out of the water are these two majestic hands coming to rescue the city, to actually hold the building up. So it's a beautiful sculpture, but it was placed in the Grand Canal where millions of people over the course of a year in Venice went past these, all taking photos, all having that kind of wow moment as you're on the Vaporetto up from the train station and suddenly you see these pair of hands rising out of the water. But while you'd have a huge volume of contemporary art in Venice during the Venice Biennale, I think it does raise the question of why a city that has so much old art, so much heritage art, needed to become a major centre for contemporary art as well. So just a couple of examples of the sorts of things you can see with a quick stroll around Venice. So these are about 5 to 10 minutes behind Piazza San Marco. So each of these works of art they're within about 5 minutes of one another. So you can go from seeing extraordinary works by Giovanni Bellini to works by Vittorio Carpaccio, such as this one which is in almost every textbook of Renaissance art. It's still in a building that belongs to kind of a Rotary Club for Dalmatian Venetians, and it's still there. And then down the road from it, you just walk down the path, and then you can visit something like the Hellenic Institute, which has this extraordinary collection of icons that were painted in Venice. But these are icons that are painted by Venice's Greek Orthodox community from the 14th through to the 18th century. So you've got Cyprian Venetians, you've got Cretan Venetians, you've got mainland Greek Venetians, you've got Aegean Venetians, people who had come to Venice and been, in some cases, their families have been there from the Middle Ages. And they're still producing these fusion styles, their own kind of unique styles of icons. So within a very small walk around in Venice, you can see an extraordinary range of art. You keep walking around, this is over down towards the Accademia, you find works more by Giovanni Bellini, by Tintoretto, by Giorgione. Around the corner from there, you've got masterpieces by Tiepolo. You've got an entire building, the Scuola Grande di San Rocco here, which is kind of the Sistine Chapel painted by Jacopo Tintoretto. So you can look at each of these paintings as painted by him. All the ones in the ceiling are painted by him. All the ones in the stairwell going up to this room are painted by him. And all of the ground floor is painted by him as well. So it's kind of an absolute efflorescence of art. And then, of course, there are the magnificent mosaics of San Marco as well. Here, a photo of them being illuminated at night. So with a city with this much art to offer, it does, I think, raise the question of why on earth did they think they needed to transform themselves into a centre for contemporary art as well? Part of the story of the creation of Venice, though, is a bit sad. So right across the 19th century, Venice is in a state of decline. It becomes a possession of Napoleon, then it becomes a possession of Austria, then it's back to Napoleon, then it's back to Austria, and then it becomes part of the Kingdom of Italy in the 1860s. During this period, Venice has really it's lost the key source of its wealth. It's no longer a major international trading city by this stage. And a lot of the old families in Venice, these old patrician families their family had been collecting art for 600 years. They have them in their palaces on the Grand Canal, couldn't afford the upkeep of their housing, so are starting to have to sell their art off on an international market to be able to pay for the upkeep of their houses. Nonetheless, by the early 1890s, a group of Venetian noblemen, 3 Venetian noblemen, were having dinner out on the Lido one night, and they knocked their heads together, and they came up with the idea that they could actually, they'd seen the World Expositions in Paris and London, etc., and they thought, well, why don't we make one of these international exhibitions just for the visual arts? And what they could do is they could give themselves 2 years to plan it, and they could hold this new international art exhibition on the silver anniversary of the King and Queen of Italy. But back in the back of their mind was an idea that what Venice would do is Venice would pay the shipping for the art to come to Venice, and in exchange, Venice would receive a cut of the sale of any of those works of art. So it's a very, very kind of long-standing tradition in Venice. Venice has very few natural resources of itself, but became kind of one of the great trading cities of medieval and Renaissance Europe, simply by moving other people's stuff around. By moving other people's stuff, by handling other people's stuff, you can take a cut and make a profit from it, which is kind of what they were thinking with the original Biennale, the first Biennale. They would pay for the shipping, they would handle the transport, and they would get a cut of the sales in return. What they didn't expect, however, was the 200,000 people turned up. They were thinking, yes, we'll get good numbers of people coming, but the sheer volume of people who turned up to this very first Biennale made them realize that actually the payoff for the city of Venice is art tourism and not the sale of art, that the city prospers from the number of people coming to look at the art, staying in the city, rather than what they can make from selling the art. Also interesting here is this is a poster for the very first Biennale in 1895, and it's showing who kind of coughed up the money to run it. So you have the Town Council of Venice put in 10,000 lira, the Veneto region put in 5,000 lira, the Ministry of Culture put in 5,000 lira, and the Casa Risparmio, a bank, put in 5,000 lira as well. So you have this kind of public-private partnership to fund the exhibition. But for a spend of 25,000 lira, they didn't expect the payoff to be 200,000 people turning up in one go. So in some ways, Venice has, just as Venice had invented, I suppose, a post-industrial economy in the 17th century, where it's a service economy in the 17th century. People are coming to Venice for tourism, for gambling, for things that they can do in Venice that they're not allowed to do at home and that sort of thing. In some ways, the Biennale is a continuation of that Venice discovers art tourism about 100 years before anybody else cottons on to the fact that people will travel vast distances to see art shows. So Venice is kind of, again, very, very forward thinking, a long way ahead of the others, of other countries. However, the Biennale changes quite significantly in its early years. And in the early 1900s, it starts becoming a kind of a nationalistic event, an event for countries, mostly European countries, to compete with one another, and they start treating the Venice Biennale as a kind of Olympics of art. So the first country to decide that they want a permanent place in the sun in Venice was Belgium, of all countries. In 1907, Belgium has pretensions for being a great colonial power. It's beginning to do some of the absolutely terrible things in places like the Congo in this period, cutting people's hands off, destroying villages, general kind of such a bad version of colonialism that the other European colonial powers intervened to stop Belgium being that nasty to people in Africa. Nonetheless, they were the first country to establish themselves as having a permanent pavilion, which is what we see here in Venice, with it has a modernist front that was put on in the 1950s, but the rest of the buildings, that original building from 1907. Once Belgium got in there, the other countries, the other imperial countries of Europe get in on the act as well and say, well, hang on, if they've got a permanent pavilion, we need to have our one too. So we find that in the following couple of years later, 2 years later, Great Britain, Hungary and Germany have established a national pavilion in Venice. Then they're followed by countries such as Russia in 1913. And they begin to treat it as an international competition. Whoever gets the prize from Venice is the most culturally prestigious in the visual arts for that 2 years. It's kind of a combination between an Olympics and a World Cup of art in this period. By 1932, we start seeing spin-offs from the Biennale start. And the very first of these spin-offs was the Venice Film Festival, which incidentally was also the world's first international film festival. Cannes doesn't start until after World War II. The Venice Film Festival has been around since the 1930s. However, shortly after the film festival was established, we see a fascist takeover of the Biennale. The power of film, the power of art to communicate en masse was too attractive to Mussolini and his cultural officers. So they take control and they turn it into a fascist kind of art event. Unsurprisingly, by the late 1930s, only 2 countries are involved. After World War II, however, kind of that fascist influence is completely removed. There's effectively a purge of the administration to remove anyone who was associated with fascism from the Biennale committee. Just to give you an idea of some of the different pavilions that you can see as you're walking around. So up here is Alvo Aalto's designed Danish Pavilion. So you have this beautiful kind of modernist, early modernist Finnish architectural space in Venice, with the trees designed in such a way that the building was designed so that the trees would grow up through the building. It's kind of fusion of nature and architecture together. You have other buildings such as Russia's, or kind of one of the most wonderful of the buildings is Hungary's from 1909. But the most modern of the buildings that you see in Venice, this is the most modern building in Venice itself, is Australia's pavilion here, which was designed by Denton Corkham Marshall and opened in 2015. There was an argument in Venice about whether we should allow a building so modern to be in Venice. You know, after all, Venice is full of Renaissance and Baroque architecture. What is something like this doing there? But then the mayor of Venice came out and made a speech in support of it, saying that, well, just as in the rest of the Giardini, the gardens in Venice, you have wonderful works. You've got a history of architecture in these gardens, and this is just a 21st century addition to the history of architecture. So as you're walking around Venice, you're getting in the Biennale, you can kind of get an architectural history as well as the best of contemporary art from around the world. It's got a wonderful location too, cantilevered out over a canal, and it's one of the, from the other side of that canal, it's one of the few pavilions you can get a really good look at. So it's sited very well. Also, the materials to construct this were shipped over from Australia. So for example, this stone facing of it is South Australian black basalt that was shipped over to Venice. So it's Australian made from Australian materials in the heart of Venice. After World War II, however, the Venice Biennale takes a very different direction and starts trying to move away from this international competition. Instead, the focus of the Biennale after World War II is about making it a non-commercial event, so much so that by the time the 1960s around, they removed prizes from the event as well. The idea kind of, if you give somebody a prize, that's kind of going against the principle of equality. You can't have everyone here and say, well, you're the best and you're better than the rest. It has to be kind of no prize giving, all artists, all people are equal. The prizes were reintroduced in the 1980s because everyone loves a prize. And it's still kind of one of the most sought after prizes you can get as an artist is the Golden Lion from the Venice Biennale. It's kind of the crowning achievement of an artist's career. But we also see the Biennale starting to show more avant-garde art. For the first time in 1948, you start seeing works by Picasso, Braque, Dufy, Arp, and Pollock. There's also the idea that the Biennale should be a focus on being an international exchange of ideas. I mean, this happens in the Venice Film Festival too. So Venice becomes the place where Europeans, Western Europeans and Americans make contact with Japanese filmmaking, Czech filmmaking, Russian filmmaking, and they're doing the same in the visual arts as well. So it's the idea that artists from around the globe can participate and it becomes an exchange of ideas. But the idea behind it is that by talking to each other, by exchanging, sharing ideas, understanding each other's culture better, we can make the world a more peaceful, a more interesting place. But behind this, there was often a strong political sense of a social purpose, especially after 1968 and the various revolutions in Europe in 1968, trying to the idea, well, this sense of peace we can create through art and international exchange really can make the world a better place. The other main change after World War II, though, is that Venice no longer pays for the shipping or takes a cut. In fact, they ban the sale of art during the Biennale completely. So all of the work you see, you can't go up and buy it. You have to know someone who knows someone, and you go up to Switzerland and you buy it there after the Biennale. But in practice, nothing in the Biennale is for sale. They're no longer paying for the shipping, which is also very convenient because in the 1950s, you start seeing the emergence of installations, giant sculptures and performance art, each of which is much more expensive to ship across the globe than a painting that is relatively easy to roll up and post. So they remove the expense before it becomes too expensive. The prime mover of this change in the Biennale, though, is Peggy Guggenheim. So Peggy had settled in Venice in the late 1940s in her palace on the Grand Canal. And in 1948, she opens her private collection of art up to the public for people to be able to come and see what is one of the finest collections in Europe of both then contemporary American art, but also of classical European modernism. Most of the artists she knew personally. She had not only the money to be able to acquire art, she had the personal relationships to get art directly from the artists of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. The other thing, though, she had is exceptionally good taste. So when she bought something from an artist, it wasn't kind of a second rate. It wasn't kind of it wasn't a bad Picasso. Instead, it ends up being an extremely good and a very influential Picasso that she is able to acquire. Anyway, it's also Peggy Guggenheim's work in Venice in promoting contemporary art that gives Jackson Pollock an introduction to Europe. So Peggy is kind of in the background, facilitating the exchange of ideas. After World War II in Europe, there's almost a sense that America is a place that has no real culture. It just makes bombs and tanks and sends money in the Marshall Plan. But when kind of European art lovers are coming and they're seeing Jackson Pollock for the first time, they're absolutely blown away by it. And it's this sudden realization in Europe that America is a place of culture too. And the culture that it's producing, this new modern American culture, is deeply interesting and influential over generations of Western European artists. So for example, this is Jackson Pollock's Alchemy, which made a huge impression. So this is a key work in art history because it's this work that people are seeing of Pollock's and starting to write about it. It's this work of Pollock's that goes on to have a huge influence over Western European painting in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Recently, this work was restored. It took a team of 50 scientists and restorers and curators to work on this one because nobody had been asked to restore old house paint on a tablecloth before. So it took 5 years and a very, very large team of experts figuring out how do you restore old house paint on a tablecloth. But when it was brought back from its restoration and shown in the Guggenheim in Venice, 250,000 people paid a ticket just to go and see this painting and learn about its restoration. So it's an extraordinary number of people going to see a single painting, but again, it's this influence this painting has had over European painting. But when Peggy opens her house to the public, just to give you an idea of the sorts of things you see inside in what was her private collection, they casually mention Clay, Picasso, Braque, Duchamp, Leger, Brancusi, Severini, Ballard, Dali, Magritte, Delaunay, Kupka, Miro, Picabia, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Van Doesburg, Giacometti, Ernst, Pollock, Rothko, Calder, Moore, and Marini. There are excellent examples of each of these artists' work still in Venice today as part of the Peggy Guggenheim collection. So it's the first of the great modern art galleries in Venice, and it was the private collection of Peggy Guggenheim. In the 80s and 90s, the Venice Biennale changes slightly. They put in a new administrative structure. They're aiming to make it more financially sustainable. And there's a sense that in the 1970s, the Biennale had become the sort of place that only people who read 50 books of art on art every day, who are getting around in skivvies, talking about it in a way that nobody else can understand. There's an idea that that idea of art is too elitist, it's too exclusive, and that what they want to do is reshape the Biennale so it's able to engage with a much broader general public, to be able to be more accessible to more people. And they've been exceptionally good at doing this, but at the same time they're balancing the Biennale off with something that is publicly accessible, with being able to display avant-garde artists who are quite challenging at the same time. The context for this change, however, is in the 1970s, we start seeing the rise of commercial art fairs and other biennales. So from the 1950s onwards, you start seeing biennales in South America, in the US, art fairs start in the 1970s in Switzerland. So there's a sense of competition, and the Biennale evolves to be able to keep itself ahead of that competition, more accessible, larger, more enjoyable. It has the natural advantage, though, of being in Venice. Parallel with this is the development of Venice as a modern art city. So, for example, the first of Venice's first modern art gallery was actually founded in 1898 by the Duchess Felicita Bevilacqua Lamasa, who donated her private palace, the Car Pesaro, to the city of Venice on the condition that it became a modern art museum. It's the first modern art museum in Italy. And it was also using her bequest to fund the development of young modern artists in and around Venice. And when you walk through this museum today, there are a number of works that have been bought from that first 50 years of the Biennale before they banned the sale of artworks. So in the background, you've got Rodin, you've got Arp, you've got kind of a great history of Italian painting in the 20th century as well. But again, in this wonderful, beautiful Baroque building on the Grand Canal. So you go from looking at contemporary and modern art, you look out the window and kind of there's the Grand Canal. It's kind of a wonderfully refreshing on the senses. Some of their work, most famous work is Klimt's Judith II, which was bought during a Biennale in the early 20th century. And they're continuing to build this collection up. The city of Venice is building this excellent modern art gallery. Even when Venice is very busy, you can go inside the Car Pesaro and find that hardly anyone is in there, which is sad, but also good for you, the viewer. The Bevilacqua Lamasa continues to support local artists, the foundation that was established in the end of the 19th century, and they even have kind of San Marco's best kept secret. So as you're looking at St. Mark's, over your back right-hand shoulder in the corner of Piazza San Marco, there's a doorway. And you go through that doorway and you find yourself in a 2-floor art gallery, which is it's a good kind of local secret again, but it's owned by the Bevilacqua Lamasa Foundation for displaying works by contemporary Italian artists inside. And again, you can have thousands of people in the piazza. You walk through this doorway and suddenly there's maybe 5 or 6 people having a look. So it's one of these kind of hidden secrets in Venice. But the growth of the Biennale goes hand in glove with the development of these collections. To use the Guggenheim as an example. So in 1985, it was converted fully into a museum. At this stage, it was just this area and the sculpture garden that was part of the museum. In 1993, they start buying up the buildings next door, originally to be able to start kind of having building in a ticket office, so they can separate the administration from the gallery spaces. A few years later, they realized it wasn't large enough. They needed more display space. So they bought 2 more neighboring buildings over here, where they could then build a space for temporary exhibitions, a bookshop, and a cafe as well. They bought kind of the next building next door over here. So across the course from 1985 through to the year 2000, in that 15 years, the Peggy Guggenheim collection more than doubles its display space. And they're doing this because the annual attendance, number of people who are going to visit her collection, skyrockets. And today, its annual ticket purchases are about 500,000 tickets a year, are making it the second most visited site in Venice after the Ducal Palace. Nonetheless, if you are there, go in the afternoon at about 3 o'clock, because that way, at the time where people are leaving because they've got to go and catch a train. So at 3 in the afternoon, it's usually quieter than it is during the day. But the Guggenheim is not the only growing art collection in Venice over the past 30, 35 years. So in 1983, Gianni Agnelli bought the Palazzo Grassi and turned it into an art gallery. So this is a 3-story art gallery on the Grand Canal in the very center of Venice, bought by Gianni Agnelli simply to show off the family art collection. A year later, another private foundation, the Giorgio Cini Foundation, opens its galleries. It now owns 6 or 7 gallery spaces for the display of art during the Biennale, as well as its own private collection in its own gallery spaces too. So we have these foundations and these private art collections opening up in Venice because they know people are coming to Venice to see the art, so they'll see your private collection too. In the background, though, is the growth of mass tourism and the problems that Venice has had with volume that it starts having in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. It's kind of the problem with the number of people who are coming to Venice is beginning to really stretch the city's resources. But there's an idea too that cultural tourism is a small branch of that tourism, and that cultural tourists and people going to look at the art in Venice were more likely to stay longer, more likely to eat in a local restaurant. They're not likely to eat, shoot and leave. So that it's a more beneficial form of tourism for the city of Venice because you're more likely to stay for longer, you're more likely to spend money in Venetian shops, and you're more likely kind of to not just kind of buy cheap trinkets that have been made in China and being sold in Venice. So Venice has been backing the Biennales as a way of trying to craft a more sustainable form of tourism for the city. But to give you an idea, the Palazzo Grassi looks like this on the outside. It even has right next to it, it's a Vaporetto stop, which makes it very easy to get to. And they stage some extraordinary exhibitions. The more recent exhibitions have come from Francois Pino's collection. Francois Pino has the largest private art collection in the world. He's kind of he's a superpower of art collecting. He bought the building from the Agnelli in 2006 to start showing off selections of his private art collection. This was 4 years ago. A giant sculpture by Damien Hirst, who had an exhibition in Venice that took up all 3 floors of this building. So you walk into this neoclassical courtyard inside the palace, only to have this whopping great big bronze sculpture confronting you. And then around it, 3 stories of art, all made by Damien Hirst. It's not technically part of the Biennale, but it just happens to conveniently be held at the same time as the Biennale. So it's there because they can. But Francois Pino doesn't have just one space in Venice. At the same time, he has his eyes on this space, the Punta della Dogana, which is an 18th century customs house in Venice, which was up for tender by the city. And the condition was that whoever uses it has to use it in a way that's beneficial for the people in the city of Venice. So Pino says, I'm going to make it into a contemporary art gallery, and I will pay Tadao Ando to come in and redesign the gallery spaces in this historic building. So you have one beautiful Japanese minimalist architecture combining with the original industrial spaces of this old customs house. And it opens up as a contemporary art gallery as well. So kind of as you make your way down the Grand Canal, you've got art gallery after art gallery after art gallery, making it very easy to hop on and off the Vaporetto, enjoy the sun of Venice in the meantime. More recently, Miuccia Prada decided that she's going to get in on the action, and she bought this palace here and then renovated it. So in this palace, you've got preserved the 17th century frescoes on the walls. You've got all the kind of the ceilings preserved, the floors preserved, and she uses it to showcase either a collection from her the Prada Foundation's art collection, or to stage kind of monographic exhibitions of particular artists. So last year was the arte povera artist Yannis Kounelis, who's born in Greece, but then migrates to Italy as a child and becomes a key Italian artist of the later 20th century. But they have his work displayed, and you can see on the sides you've got kind of the contemporary art installations, and then around here next to them you've got the 17th century frescoes. So you get this beautiful contrast between old and new. But the most recent change in context of the Venice Biennale has been a move away from thinking of it as an event for national participants only. And what's driving this over the past, particularly 5 to 7 years in particular, is the idea that many people experience the world transnationally as part of multiple nations or as diasporas. And how do you represent the experience? How do you represent these people in an exhibition that has been thought of as this is something that only nation states get to participate in? So one of the first groups to move in to try and open up, to move away from an idea of it just being nations, to try and encompass a greater range of people, was the anonymous Stateless Immigrants Pavilion, who set up by putting these signs around the city of Venice, telling you where their pavilion is. In some years, they haven't actually had a pavilion, and you're just trying to find it. You get lost in the city of Venice looking for someone who can help, looking to try and find what you're after. And in that sense, it's kind of reflecting the experience of migration, reflecting the experience of statelessness, getting people who aren't stateless to kind of share vicariously that sense of looking for something and being unable to find it. In other years, they've set up a small little office where you then line up, and they will stamp your passport saying you're an anonymous stateless migrant. If you don't have your passport on you, they will issue you with an identity document. Again, it's kind of a type of performance art, trying to kind of move away from a very national way of understanding the past and the national idea of understanding participation in an international event. Other countries have also tried some radical things. So Iceland in 2015 realized kind of Venice has a very, very long history of engaging with the Islamic world. For hundreds and hundreds of years, Venice has been a go-between between Western Europe and the Islamic world, but it has no mosque. So they turned this abandoned church, they set it up, the church was abandoned in the 19th century. They rented the space out and turned it into a mosque for the Muslims of Venice, whose nearest mosque is on the mainland. However, the authorities in Venice at the time were part of Italy's far right, and they had this shut down on an OHS, for OHS. There were too many people standing near the doorway. They had a desk in the wrong place of the room. That was a fire safety issue, so they have to close down their pavilion. But it was a politically motivated act. Other kind of diasporas who have been working in Venice recently include Armenia. So the Armenian Pavilion, although Armenia is a nation state, for the most part tries to represent the Armenian diaspora in the works that they show there. Their exhibition in 2015 called Amenity won the Golden Lion, so won the first prize for the best national participation, even though it was the participation of a diaspora in Venice in 2015. It was not coincidental that 2015 was the centenary of the Armenian genocide. And what a lot of these exhibitions were doing were reflecting on that experience, the idea of roots, setting new roots down, carrying a precious piece of culture to somewhere safe and being able to plant it and let that culture grow again. So it was a beautiful exhibition, and there's just some works here by the artist Anna Bokigoyan from this exhibition. There's also recently, from 2017, a pavilion of the diasporas themselves, which was an organization that's set up mostly in former Commonwealth countries to try and reflect the importance of diasporas to these national stories. So in this case here, we've got Yinka Shonebar's The British Library, looking very un-British. These are the participants in this particular year were mostly African and Caribbean citizens, or citizens of the UK, artists in the UK, whose background, their heritage is in Africa and the Caribbean, and see understanding themselves and the culture they bring as a diaspora living inside right throughout the UK, and they were being given a place. So this wasn't the official UK pavilion. The UK has its own exhibition space, but the diasporas from the UK in this exhibition were showing them, hiring a space and setting themselves up to participate on kind of an even level with the great nations of the world. And most recently, and I'll end with this, was Edmund Davau's exhibition, which he held in the Venice Biennale last year, where what he's created here, so this is an exhibition that was set, this part was set in the old Athenaeum, a place for the exchange of ideas between the gentlemen of Venice. But in there, he installs this room, which is actually made of porcelain, and he creates a library of exile. So he creates a library inside this space, and every single book in this library, there are more than 1,000 of them, were works of literature written by writers in exile. And the idea was that people would be able to come, you could take the books off the shelf, you could sit in the corner and start reading them. And kind of as this kind of great experience of people in exile being brought together through their literature, through this kind of a culture that can be transmitted across generations, across continents. But his exhibition in 2019 was also the first exhibition to start kind of engaging with the Jewish Museum in the Jewish ghetto in Venice. So we have his works of art in the museum, but also in the ladies' gallery of one of the 5 synagogues in the Jewish ghetto in Venice. And one of these works here, Tehillim, was the Psalm, is set up along a wall as you're moving along, and you've got here kind of a very, very fine piece that's gold leaf in each of these vitrines, and in front of it 2 pieces of marble that have been ground, polished down, and made so thin that they become translucent. So these beautiful, very, very fragile works in these vitrines. But it's again, he's kind of, especially when connecting these works to his library of exile, to kind of reflect the experience of people in motion, people who are traveling around the world as both exiles, but also as people who are creating new homes and new cultures. This week, this same exhibition, which first showed in Venice, has just opened up in the British Museum. So it opened on the British Museum on the 27th of August if you wanted to kind of see more about it. I'm sure there'll be reviews of the Wales exhibition in the papers over the next week or so, probably this weekend. Well, thank you once again. It's been wonderful to be able to share this with you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.